Perfect. We can begin. So, okay, everyone, welcome to Improving Pasture Quality and Productivity with Sarah Flack, the final live learning session within the New Brunswick Soil and Crop Improvement Association Best Management Practices Virtual Learning Series. Support for this activity has been provided by the On-Farm Climate Action Fund. We will share information in the chat on how to access support for best management practices through this fund. The event also has CCA CAU credit available. We will also be attaching a document in the chat in order to receive credit for this event. And as well as previously said, the live learning session is available in French. We'll be putting instructions again in the chat if it was missed before on how to access the translation channel. And we will have a question period at the end, so please feel free to use the chat or ask questions or unmute during that time. A quick intro into our presenter. So Sarah Flack is an author, consultant specializing in providing practical information in agronomy and farm business planning to grass-based livestock farmers, organizations, institutions, and individuals. She has written extensively about grass farming and has participated in several projects and is known for teaching workshops that take a practical approach to applying the science of grazing. And now I will pass it to Sarah to begin.
Great. Thank you so much, Drew. And Drew, just give me a thumbs up. Let me know that the audio is still working correctly.
Yep,
Great.
you're perfect.
Thank you. All right. So I've been doing grazing consulting since the early 1990s, and my background is in agronomy. But over the years, what I have ended up doing is, in addition to doing agronomic consulting and writing, I have also been doing a lot of financial and business planning with farmers because I find that it's been important when making agronomic improvements on the farms that we are tying that into the financial planning and business planning to make sure that the changes we're doing improve labor efficiency, improve net income, improve profitability, as well as improving the soils and the plants and the cows. So I'll be sometimes talking a little bit about the business planning aspects of grazing and sometimes just about the grazing practices and pasture improvement. But I'm going to keep the focus today on going over the basics of what good grazing management is and then how to use that information to do pasture improvements. So in terms of the benefits, obviously improving pasture improves your yield, the quality, and can give you a longer grazing season. But there's also benefits of improved soil structure, increasing the plant density and cover, which can improve water infiltration into the soil. It can also improve soil health, so you have better water holding capacity, and that lowers the downstream risk of flooding, can improve water quality, so you've got less runoff, no soil loss from a well-managed pasture, and it builds in more drought resilience. And so that all directly helps with the climate change challenges that all the farmers that I'm working with now face is how do we deal with these high rainfall events and how do we deal with these extended dry periods that we didn't used to get. It also produces nice habitat for wildlife and pollinators, and it's just nicer to look at than a poorly managed pasture. And then the financial benefits of good grazing management, the primary benefit I see is there is improved quality, so the animals will do better. But a lot of times when I'm doing the financial planning with the farm, where I'm really seeing a lowering of cost and an increase in net income, is by extending the length of the grazing season. So then you have less of those winter feed costs, but also less of the power bills, the bedding, all of those other expenses associated with having the animals in the winter housing. So these are some of the questions that I like to ask when working with a farm on changing their grazing system to make sure that we're asking the right questions to tie things into the farm's overall financial business plan, cash flow projections, and things like that. So really thinking about the herd size and stocking rate for the farm, both in terms of what is best suited for the farm's land base and grazing system and crops, but also how does changing the herd size or stocking rate on the farm change your cost of production, net income, and profitability? So, since I mentioned stocking rate already, I figured I would immediately just go through two definitions for terms that can sometimes get mixed up with each other. Stocking rate that I mentioned already is the total number of animals on the whole farm or on the whole acreage. So a lot of times this will be expressed for of animals per acres of pasture, but also if the farm is making all of their own crops or a lot of their own crops, it'll be the total acreage and the total number of animals. Stocking density is a different term. This is the number of animals, or sometimes it's expressed in pounds or kilograms of animal per acre or per hectare in a specific paddock at a specific time. So stock density is today in the pasture, how many pounds of animals are there per acre? Stocking rate is how many animals are on the whole farm. So I'm going to be talking about what I just simply call good grazing management. I don't tend to use any of the specific terms of grazing systems, but good grazing management systems include some of the rotational grazing systems, but more typically management intensive grazing or holistic planned grazing or adaptive grazing. Those are the terms I usually see associated with these good grazing systems, but they all have the same underlying principle. And when it's done correctly, your primary tool to improve the pasture are actually the livestock themselves. So good grazing management and having a really good understanding of the basic principles of that is the place to start. Then we may also do soil testing and apply some fertility inputs. Maybe we'll also add some new seed, but I never want to spend the money on importing fertilizer or expensive seed until we know we've established a good grazing management system. So we're not wasting that money on fertility inputs and seed before we fixed the grazing system. So let's talk now about what a good grazing system is. I like to use this photo to start because it shows an example of a high plant density. You can't see bare soil between the plants, so that means the soil is protected from hot, sunny days. The soil is also protected from impacts from raindrops hitting the soil surface. It's going to be gently filtered down water to those plants. And there's really nice diversity in here. There's multiple species of legumes, as well as multiple species of grass. And here in the foreground is an example of one of the other groupings of plants I like to see in pastures. This is a forb, F-O-R-B, and those are in pastures, those are the plants that are the non-grass, non-legume plants. And so that's a forage chicory plant that's been intentionally planted to add more diversity to the pasture. So good grazing systems are managing grazing adapted perennial plants in a way that meets those plants' physiological needs so that those plants become healthier and more productive over time in that grazing system. So a quick look at some of the grass anatomy. This is a perennial pasture plant, and here we have the seed heads forming after flowering. This long stem here is called the tiller, the extended tiller, and this is the crown at or just above the soil surface. There's going to be multiple growing points on this crown, and each one of those growing points can turn into another tiller. Sometimes those tillers will just be vegetative, like this one over here. Sometimes they're going to go into reproductive mode and elongate the internodes between the leaves here so that they can produce a flower and seed. A lot of the energy that the plant stores for itself that it needs to use to regrow is stored either in the crown here or in the bottom 2 inches or so of most of our cool season perennial grasses. So, one of the things we need to be thinking about in designing our good grazing system is we need to prevent the animals from grazing the plants down too short so they're not consuming the plant's energy storage reserve. And we need to make sure the animals aren't consuming any of the crown of the plant or damaging that crown where those growing points are. So these are the guidelines that underlie all of the good grazing systems out there. Number one is we want to make sure the regrowth periods between grazings are varied according to the plant's stage of maturity, so that you're constantly monitoring the pastures and making sure your perennial plants are fully recovered before they are grazed again or before they go into winter or drought dormancy. You want to have relatively short periods of occupation. So that's going to control your stocking density, and that will prevent regrazing of recovering plants. So you don't want to leave the animals in the paddock for long enough that plants are starting to regrow and get grazed off again. So those are our two grazing guidelines, variable recovery periods and relatively short periods of occupation. So this is an example of what it might look like. This is a sheep farm. They have just moved the sheep with their guard dog and water and minerals into this paddock. So you can get a sense of what a fully recovered bunch of plants look like. Some of them have been grazed down a little bit already. They're going to be left in this paddock for 12 to 24 hours. And you can see here on the left side of the slide, you can see some of the post-grazing residual left behind from when they grazed the previous paddock. So this is a nice short period of occupation and a fully recovered bunch of plants. Here's what it looks like with a grass-fed dairy herd later in the year when some of the plants have gone into reproductive stage. So you've got some seed heads in there. But again, this is fully recovered plants ready to be grazed again. Maybe a little overmature for a dairy herd. One of the reasons that it's nice to have that short period of occupation is that not only is it easier to control how short the animals graze the plants, so they're not in there too long, taking it down too short, but it also controls the manure distribution. So this is, I believe, a 7-day paddock, and the animals are in there long enough that they are transporting a lot of manure over towards the water tank. The darker colored spots are the feces, the manure. The lighter colored green spots are just urine. So you can see there's a lot of grazing going over on this side of the paddock, but as they walk towards the gate and the water tank, a lot of the manure is being deposited over there. So you're going to get an uneven distribution of manure. And that wouldn't be happening if the animals were only in that paddock for a half a day or a day. So the more frequently you move them, the shorter the period of occupation, the better the manure distribution is. So I want to just quickly talk about overgrazing damage. It can vary from this sort of a situation where the animals have grazed the pastures very short repeatedly, and we've got permanently stunted plants. If it's steep, you can also have the beginnings of low plant density and soil erosion happening. But with a lower stocking rate, with a smaller herd size in a very large paddock, you can also get overgrazing damage that'll look really different, where you're more likely to have taller growing patches of weeds starting to come in, but it's still also overgrazing damage because the most desirable plants are getting grazed as they are starting to recover and regrow. So the good plants that you want get damaged and stunted, and the weeds have a competitive advantage. Continuous grazing is still the most common form of grazing system in the US and Canada, and it's also the one that most rapidly degrades the plants and the soils in the pasture. If you move from a continuously grazed system where the animals are left in the paddock for weeks or months or the whole season to a rotational system where you might have 3 to 10 paddocks that you rotate through on a set rotation, that will start to improve the pasture productivity and quality, but you won't really get the full advantage of the good grazing practices until you move to one of the grazing systems that have these variable recovery periods where you're really monitoring plant growth and only moving them into the new paddocks when those paddocks, the plants in those paddocks are fully regrown. So the good grazing systems, really what you're doing is managing the timing. You're managing how long they're in the paddock and how long it is before you put them back into the paddock. So the more paddocks that you have, whether you're using permanent fence or portable fences, the more paddocks that you have, the more control over the timing that you have. In addition to trying not to let the livestock graze things down too short, another way to protect these plants is not always grazing them in exactly the same fixed order. So we can talk a little bit about that in the question and answer period at the end also. I like to see the farmers grazing their paddocks in different orders each year. So that way you're adding in a little bit of disturbance where the pre-grazing height, the post-grazing height, how much you trample is going to vary from paddock to paddock each year. And that'll improve the quality of the pasture better than being on the same rotation every year. So overgrazing damage occurs when the plant regrazes a plant while it's regrowing from its energy reserves instead of from active photosynthesis energy. So that's usually happening if they're staying in the paddock too long. In our climate in the east, it's usually 3 days or longer. You'll start getting that regrazing of regrowing plants. Or if they're returned to a paddock too soon before it's fully recovered. We don't have time to go through my full list of all of the things that you can do to improve the pastures, but I will be doing some on-farm workshops later this summer and fall, and we'll dig into these in more detail then. But there's a huge number of things you can do with the animals to improve the pastures. You can also be improving the soil health and soil fertility. You can bring in new seed and do some reseeding. You can do some clipping and mowing carefully. So you're doing some benefit, hopefully not some damage with clipping or mowing incorrectly. And then observation and monitoring is also an important part of the pasture improvement toolbox, as I call it. So I just want to mention the fact that water infiltration, water holding capacity is becoming increasingly important as our climate has changed. And the better your grazing practices, the better your soil is going to function and be more resilient in either high rainfall events or in dry periods of time. This is just an example of one of the really nicely aggregated soils on one of the farms here in the northeastern US that I was working with. You can see the pasture plant roots have gone very deeply into the soil. They're improving the aggregation of the soil, and this is creating more pore space so that there's better infiltration, better water holding capacity. So I'm going to show a few slides just so you can get a sense of how regrown the plants need to be when you start grazing them. We'll look at them first in spring grazing, and then we'll look at regrowth after the second or the third grazing. So this pasture is early spring, and from a plant health perspective, these plants are not yet ready to be grazed, despite the fact that one of my sheep is grazing in there. But you do need to start grazing some of your paddocks each spring before they're fully ready. Otherwise, your whole farm is going to get ahead and you'll have too many overmature plants in more of your pastures. So when you start grazing in the spring, it's best not to start grazing in the same paddock every spring. start your grazing order in a different paddock, so you're spreading that kind of somewhat negative impact of grazing one area too early in the spring out to multiple paddocks. So that those plants weren't quite ready to be grazed. This is me before my hair turned white, taking a measurement with a grazing stick. This pasture is now closer to being ready to be grazed. You can see it's taller and there's more leaves on each tiller. And then this pasture is obviously fully ready to be grazed and might have been ideally higher quality if we had grazed it a little bit earlier before many of the grasses produced the seed heads. So what we're aiming for is to graze the plants when they're in this middle stage so that they're not just vegetative. They've got more leaves on them, but they haven't gone to full seed production, which will lower the fiber digestibility and the quality of the pastures. So mature enough that the plants are fully recovered and have replenished their own energy reserves, but not too overmature for the animals. So now let's look at what the animals leave behind, and that's called the post-grazing residual. And those are the parts of the plants that are still attached to the plants when the animals come out. And this is an example of a very nice post-grazing residual where there's somewhere between 3 and 6 inches of plant material still left behind on those plants. Some of it's trampled, some of it's got manure on it. There's a close-up so you can see it's not even and tidy looking, but there's a nice amount of residual still left behind to protect those plants, and the plant's energy reserves have not been consumed by the animals. Here's an example where you can see that there's a little bit more left behind, but again, this is a nice post-grazing residual. Here's a group of beef cows doing some selective grazing in some pastures. And here's what it looks like after they're done grazing that pasture. So again, that's a nice post-grazing residual, plenty of protection for the plants and the soil. Sometimes it's going to look a bit rougher, and some farmers may choose to do some clipping or mowing right after the animals come out. But overall, it's often best not to clip or mow those pastures when you pull the animals out unless there is a very specific reason to do it. And we can talk more about clipping as a tool. This is a pasture in Ontario during a drought where in the previous grazing, it looked a little bit like that previous slide with tufts of the bunch grasses left behind ungrazed. They chose not to mow it or clip it after that grazing, which slowed the wind coming across the field, added a little bit of shade, and you can see there's very nice regrowth coming up between those rejected tall pieces of grass. And so this is an example of in a drought, this was a pretty severe drought when I took this slide in Ontario, they're getting really nice regrowth in that nicely protected pasture because they did not clip afterwards and damage those plants by clipping them more, and they left that tall residual to protect the other plants. So it doesn't always look tidy, but sometimes it's best to leave it. You can also graze with a higher stocking density with more animals in a smaller area, and you can get more of a trampled residual like this. This is a slide I took right after a beef herd went through at a very high stocking density, and they grazed the burdock plants to a point where the only thing left on the burdock are these stems. So that's an example of how you can use that high density grazing and trampling to really eliminate a weed species. But I wouldn't do this with, for example, a lactating dairy herd because that would be pushing their nutritional needs a little too much and they might suffer on milk production. But I would do that with, in this case, a group of beef cows. See, we talked a little bit about clipping and after grazing. We can talk more about that in the questions session if you want to. Just a few more photographs looking at regrowth. This is a pasture on about 3 days of growth after it's been grazed. And so you can see there's already 3 or 4 inches of new leaf growth on these plants. And this is why it's very important to monitor your plants in the pasture. And the faster they are regrowing, the shorter the period of occupation you need to use in those paddocks. So on this farm, they might need to do 1 day in each paddock instead of 3 days so that they can avoid having the animals regrazing the plants that are rapidly growing because they're always your most productive plants. This is after a little more than a week, and you can see there's still a lot of these plants where they've just re-elongated leaves that have been bitten off. If you see the little flat end on these leaves, these are the original leaves that were in there when it was grazed. They've re-elongated a little bit, but there's not actually a lot of new leaves growing yet. These ones with the pointy ends are the new leaves. So this pasture is not yet ready to graze either. This one also not yet ready to graze. Look at how tall these re-elongated leaves are, but there's still not a huge number of new leaves growing in here. So not quite ready to graze. Here's one where we're seeing lots of pointy new leaves, and it's 9 or 10 inches long. So this one might be ready to graze, but I would encourage you to count leaves on grass tillers and not just use the height of the grasses to tell you whether your pasture is ready to graze. And ideally, you want to be grazing. It depends a little bit on the grass species that you're managing for, but you want to generally have 3 or 4 new leaves with these pointy ends on each grass tiller. So here's a grass tiller that is ready to graze. Here's 2 that are not yet ready to graze that are just in a 1.5 leaf stage, but this one's in a 3 leaf stage, so it's ready to graze. So this is a growth curve where we can look at the typical cool season grasses that we usually have in our northern climates. They tend to produce lots of dry matter in the spring. They'll have a slump in the summer, more and more of a slump depending on how hot and dry it is. And then they might have a little surge of growth later in the year. We can improve that with improved species, improved soil fertility, and then some people will also mix in a warm season crop midsummer, which in northern climates is typically an annual crop such as sorghum or forage millet or Sudan grass. So that means that our recovery periods are going to be faster in the spring and slower later in the year. So you're going to need to slow the speed that you're rotating through those paddocks as your pasture plant growth rates slow down. So during the grazing season, you want to be monitoring the plants, but also the livestock and the soils. I often do pasture walks where I bring a shovel and I'm looking at the soils as well as the plants and the animals. You may need to do replanting midsummer if our weather gets unpredictable, which it increasingly does with our new climate. You may have to change the stocking rate and keep an eye out for new invasive species of weeds coming in. There are some pasture monitoring worksheets that you can use. This is a simple one that's in the back of my book, just going through 5 or 6 specific points that you can go out and monitor and make some notes on. There's also some more extensive ones, holistic management. They have some really good, very detailed pasture ecosystem monitoring systems. And then similarly monitoring the livestock for things like rumen fill, body condition, how fast they're growing, how much milk they're making. For dairy animals, we can look at milk urea nitrogen and milk production, keeping an eye out for heat stress and behavior changes that might indicate that they're not doing well in the grazing system. So monitoring the plants, the soils, and the animals. So I want to talk a little bit about how we manage to increase the dry matter intake of pasture by the animals. So dry matter intake, sometimes I'm going to use the acronym DMI in my slides to indicate dry matter intake. Dry matter intake for pasture is the amount per bite, so the intake per bite, times the rate of biting. How many bites can an animal take in a day? Or in an hour, times how much time are they spent out grazing. So how much per bite, how many bites can they take in an hour, how many hours are they on pasture? That is the basic math to be able to figure out how much can your cows or sheep or goats really eat out on the pasture. And that intake per bite is one of the things that we can really change with good grazing management. If we can increase the plant density in the pasture, specifically the number of grass tillers per square foot in that pasture, and make sure that pasture is at the correct pre-grazing height, that's going to increase the amount of pasture dry matter that the animal can get per bite, and that will improve their grazing efficiency so they can fill their rumens more quickly out on the pasture. So we need to think about what are all of the things we can manage for to get higher plant density and more tillers per square foot in our pasture. Pasture height is really important. If the pasture is too short when you turn the animals into it, they're just going to get a tiny bit per bite. And a cow can only take about 20 or 25,000 bites a day. That sounds like a lot, but she's also got to chew her cud. Sheep and a goat has a much faster bite rate. They can take 40 or 50,000 bites per day. So it's a little bit easier for them to fill their rumen, even if the pasture height isn't quite right. But particularly for your high performance animals, like lactating dairy cows or animals you're trying to finish and growing for meat and finish on pasture, you really need to pay attention to that pre-grazing height. Make sure it's tall enough that they can get a full mouthful in each bite. So here is a photograph of two different pastures to think about this concept of maximizing the dry matter per bite. You can also see the quality is going to be really different between these two pastures. So this pasture here is a little bit taller and much more diverse and has a lot more plant density, particularly right at the top of the pasture sward. So animals in here are going to get a lot more dry matter per bite than in this less diverse pasture that is just grasses with a lower density of grass tillers per square foot. Conversely, this also is a better solar panel in terms of the plants capturing all of the sunlight and growing more vigorously and producing more quantity of pasture for you. So maximizing pasture intake and livestock productivity. Number one is managing for higher plant density, managing for the correct pre-grazing height. It's also how much residual plant do you leave behind? And so let's look at that in the next slide. So this was a workshop that we did in northern Vermont a few years ago where we were trying to figure out where the most of the quality in the pasture is in terms of the number of bites that an animal is taking and how much she's leaving behind. And here is some forage test data to look at the nutritional content in the top 3 inches of a pasture, the middle 3 inches, and the bottom 3 inches. This was done in orchard grass, but it's similar in the other grass species. So here you can see very high crude protein in the top. In the middle, there's still plenty of crude protein. The bottom 3 inches, significantly lower protein content. And if we look at the neutral detergent fiber, in the top, you have much less of the the less digestible fiber. So you have more digestibility in the top. The middle portion of this orchard grass plant also has really nice fiber digestibility. The bottom third of this orchard grass is not worth grazing. It's got a lot of non-digestible fiber. This is the net energy for lactation, which is very high in the top two-thirds of the pasture plant. That bottom third, again, is much lower energy. So it's really a win-win for the plants and the animals to leave behind that bottom 2 to 4 inches of the plant. So I want to talk a little bit more about extending the grazing season because I do see when I'm doing business planning with farmers that this is usually the number one thing we can do to lower their feed costs and move towards a larger net income and better farm profitability. So you're eliminating weeks or hopefully months of stored winter feed, bedding, and other winter housing costs. Number one is fertile, healthy soils. Some farms are using some annuals for early spring grazing, for late fall into winter grazing, and also grazing through the midsummer slump if things are hot and dry. There's pros and cons to that, but for some farms, that's been a really good strategy. Carefully managing for a highly diverse plant species, making sure you have the right stocking rate on the farm, and doing forward-looking grazing planning. We'll talk about that in a minute, can also really help extend the length of the grazing season. This is just an inspirational photo to look at some cows that are grazing in January. And this is just a reminder that I'm just hitting a few of the key points for improving the pastures, extending the length of time that they're growing and producing dry matter for us. And there's a lot more we can go into these, so feel free to ask me questions in the discussion after our session here today. So ideally, as we're applying any one of these pasture improvement strategies or tools, we really want to make sure we keep coming back to making sure we're meeting the nutritional and behavioral needs of the animals and the financial and quality of life needs of the farmers. So some of these grazing systems that I'm talking about where you might be moving from wanting to move the animals more frequently, you need to really think about labor. And this is a photo that I think speaks to that very well. Moving the portable electric sheep fence can be very labor intensive. So if you've decided to go to a system where you're moving the flock or the herd twice a day instead of every week, got to make sure that you've got enough labor on the farm to be able to do that. There's some really nice innovation happening with electric fence technology that is making that easier to do. One of which is the virtual fence being used now increasingly, where the animals are wearing a collar and the invisible fence is being managed from an app on your phone. That's certainly less labor than than moving these electric net fences and polywire. It doesn't offer you the same level of predator control, obviously, and there's still some glitches in the technology being worked out. But there are other methods such as tumble wheels and fence lifters that you can use to lower the labor requirements of moving towards these better grazing systems. So I mentioned doing the grazing planning earlier. This is my favorite way to help farmers plan out their grazing season and also keep their grazing records. This is a farmer in northern Vermont who is keeping track of several different groups of animals. They've got a sheep flock and they have several beef herds. So the different animal groups are in different colors on his grazing chart here. And so he's able to keep track both of where the animals have grazed, where he's hayed, and then he can also do forward planning. And this chart is in my experience, one of the best ways to be able to really think about how long you can make your grazing season by starting to plan for December and then thinking backwards from that on how long does the regrowth or recovery period between grazings need to be for the different areas of your farm, and what would your grazing plan need to look like for the year so that you could graze over a longer window. Obviously, ice and deep snow is also going to limit how long you can graze. But within those limitations, the grazing chart can really help with both record keeping and planning it out. This is an example of the how you can do the math to calculate how many acres you need per day or per paddock for whatever group size that you have. And it's basically taking the number of animals in the group, what their dry matter demand is, how much they need to eat. You're subtracting out of that any dry matter from supplemental feed. And then that gives you the dry matter of the entire group of animals for a 24-hour period. Then, and we can talk about this in the discussion or in some of the on-farm workshops I'll do later this year. Then the next thing you need to do is get an estimate of how much available dry matter is there per acre for your animals to graze. Then we know that required amount that the group needs, and we have the available amount per acre. So if you take the required amount for the whole herd or flock and you divide that by the amount available per acre, that's going to give you the paddock size for a 24-hour period. And then you can use that either in that previous grazing chart for your grazing planning, or you can multiply that paddock size out by your estimated recovery periods that you need, and that'll give you an idea of how many total acres that you need. So for example, if you calculate that you need 1 acre per day and the pasture needs about a month to regrow, you're going to need 31 acres because it needs to regrow for 30 days. They're grazing the paddock that they're in right now, so it's not regrowing yet. And so 31 total paddocks of an acre each would be what you would need for that group of animals. The longer your period of occupation, the lower the efficiency in your grazing system. So you can see I redid the math here. If you're doing 3 acre paddocks and moving them every 3 days, you're going to need more acres. And the longer that period of occupation is, the additional acreage needed starts to grow somewhat exponentially once you get beyond about a 3-day period of occupation in the paddock. So far we've just been talking about how to use the animals and the grazing system to improve the pastures, but I do want to talk a little bit about soil fertility and when you need to improve your soils and when you should be considering adding seed or reseeding a pasture. So the number one thing to do is make sure you're taking a soil test before you spend any money on seed. The really good pasture species, the seed is expensive. And so you want to make sure the soil fertility is balanced before you start adding that very expensive high quality seed out there. I also recommend that you don't use generic pasture mixes of seeds that just come in a bag and say pasture mix. I'm finding that increasingly there are unpalatable species of grasses in particular in those mixtures that create long-term problems in the pastures because you're introducing usually a grass variety that your animals won't want to eat. And so over time, those less palatable grasses will spread and have a competitive advantage. So do the research and make sure you're getting varieties that are known to be palatable. In terms of seeding, we can overseed or frost seed. That can work really well, particularly with the hard coat seeds of legumes like red clover and white clover. Sometimes if the soil temperature and moisture is good and you have a low density pasture, you can spread the seed out and then do a high stock density grazing and have them trample the seed into the pasture. Sometimes you could, if you have species in your pasture that you like, you can let it mature and go to seed and then maybe trample those seeds in. Letting it go to seed means that the quality of that pasture is lower, and it will also have grown tall enough that it might start to shade out some of the less shade tolerant species in the pasture. So it's not a great strategy for all farms, but it is one that some folks will do if they want to reseed some good quality pastures where they've got good things already growing. Ideally, if you are adding seed to an existing pasture, using a no-till drill will get you the best seed to soil contact, and you'll probably get the best germination and establishment rate with that. And then if a pasture, for some reason, you've decided that it's really just the wrong species, or maybe it was previously an annual field that needs to be converted to a perennial pasture, that's when you might consider doing a full tillage, harrowing, and reseeding. This is a photograph of using a no-till drill to introduce legumes and some forbs. We put forage chicory and I think a little bit of narrow leaf plantain, several legume species, and some improved grasses into an existing pasture just by grazing it very short to decrease the competition from the existing plants, and then went through with a no-till drill. So with the soils, well, actually, before we talk about soils, I'll just point out this is the seed I just mentioned, the narrow leaf plantain. This plant right here, this is one of the forbs that some farmers are managing to maintain, or in some cases, add a very small amount of it to their pastures to increase the diversity. In terms of soils, I recommend doing observations above ground, observations underground with a shovel, as well as doing the lab testing, the forage testing, to see whether you've got some deficiencies of nutrients in the soil that you need to add. So this is some of the soil surface observation that I do. In this case, I'm looking at the soil surface to see how much litter, how much residue is on there. I'm looking for plant density. And in this case, I'm also seeing a really lovely amount of earthworm activity with the earthworm castings on the soil surface. This is what I call a shovel test, where I'll take a long, pointed, narrow-bladed shovel and I'll dig up a little circular piece of soil to look at how healthy the plant roots are, what the soil aggregation looks like, whether there's signs of compaction. And I will say with climate change, I am increasingly seeing more compaction, certainly in the eastern part of Canada and the US, where I work most of the time, because we're having more high rainfall events and people are using increasingly heavy equipment for spreading the manure and harvesting. And so I'm seeing more soil compaction from the heavy equipment on those wet soils. So this is an example of discovering soil compaction during one of these shovel tests. You can see this plant root went straight down, hit the pan layer, and went sideways. So these shovel tests can really help us understand what some of the limiting factors in the soils are, other than perhaps some soil nutrient fertility deficiencies. So just a reminder, don't spend the money on the seed and the fertilizer until you know you've fixed the grazing system so it's going to maintain those plants in a way that's really healthy. I often like to go back to some of the very old written information about improving grazing systems and improving pasture quality, just to build some humility into things. A lot of the concepts that I talk about have been known for many, many years. This is a quote from 1898. Which says the management of the pasture is even more important than the selection of the seed and the preparation of the land. So just wrapping things up here, we talked about how to maximize pasture dry matter intake so the animals do really well. The key to that is high plant density with lots of vegetative leaf area that's easy for them to bite off and graze and fill their mouths effectively and efficiently with, combined with a short period of occupation. So that's ideal for our livestock to maximize pasture dry matter intake. Then we also want to make sure we allow enough time between grazings so that those plants grow back to that ideal pre-grazing height so that the animal can get enough dry matter per bite and it's not too short, which would cause inefficient grazing. So that's how we maximize pasture dry matter intake. And conveniently, that is also exactly how we improve the pastures with these shorter periods of occupation in each paddock and recovery or regrowth periods between grazings that are long enough for the plants to fully recover. And I think that gets me all the way through my slides and leaves us with plenty of time for questions and answers.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Great presentation. We do have a couple questions in the chat, so we will be moving into the question and answer period. So feel free to input any questions you have into the chat.